spending years of studying Rod Serling and Twilight Zone, hearing names like Richard Matheson and Earl Hamner Jr., George Clayton Johnson, I never thought I'd have a chance to meet any of them, much less introduce any of them. Several months ago, as the committee was talking about trying to find a really great keynote speaker and not having much luck at that point, we had some great speakers, but we were looking for somebody really special. And I was talking to Jason Brock, an acquaintance I made who publishes Dark Discoveries magazine. Some of the young folks particularly are into that horror science fiction magazine. I didn't know it existed until I went online, but it's a really cool magazine, contemporary type of thing. And so I was talking to him and talking about our dilemma of trying to find a great keynote speaker, and he mentioned that, like, oh, how about George Clayton Johnson? And I said, like, really? And he said, oh yeah, I just interviewed him and I'll have him call you. It's like, great, I really didn't expect it to happen. And then a couple days later, my wife and I are in the situation where we only use cell phones these days, so I had given him my cell number, and I'm driving to the grocery store and the phone rings. And on the other end is this man over here. He said, I'm George Clayton Johnson. I was asked to call you. And so I pulled over, even though you're allowed to talk on the cell phone in North Carolina. I pulled over, and we chatted. And in about 2 minutes, we had an agreement for him to come and speak. And I was so excited, I had to call my wife. You'd never guess who I just talked to. George Clayton Johnson is the co-author of a really important science fiction novel, Logan's Run, which was later made into a movie. My wife and I also had to go out and rent that and look at it because it's a few years old, and I had to see it again. It still holds up as a classic science fiction story. He also wrote the story for Ocean's 11, which has been through several incarnations. The first one with Frank Sinatra, and then of course George Clooney and Brad Pitt in the new version. And he's responsible for the story or the script for about 7 Twilight Zone episodes, including one that I think is probably one of the most touching human stories of the entire bunch. Just a warm story about a woman who's aging, and I guess it didn't hurt that I had just gone through the aging of my own parents' death within the last couple of years. It's titled There's Nothing in the Dark, and starred Gladys Cooper and a young, almost unknown actor at that point named Robert Redford. And this man is the author of that episode. I went back and watched that again immediately because I wanted to check it out. So in hosting today, I had a chance to hang out with George a little bit and listen to him, and I came to the conclusion that writers are really special people. They think about things a little bit differently. They look at the world differently, and then they sort of interpret it for the rest of us into really interesting stories. And George is also into some really cutting-edge stuff that I was amazed at. Some things that our students are involved in. And this man is doing stuff, creating stuff for the internet and cell phone communication stories and videos and things. So we have the privilege of really experiencing a legend in the television writing business tonight. And we're going to hear from him speak as soon as he comes up and introduces and autographs my book that he gave me this morning, The Twilight Zone Stories of George Clayton Johnson. So I introduce you to George Clayton Johnson. Good friend Gordon. Good artwork too. He's writing another script.
Now you have to read it first.
There's a quote for you. Darkness is faster than light.
So here we are, and I'm George Clayton Johnson, as the gentleman said. I fought most of my life to keep my Clayton. People keep trying to take it away from me. They think it unusual that I want to call myself by the name that my mother gave me. But I have always believed that that's who I was. And I know I got my first laugh in the first grade when all the students stood up in front of their desks, one after the other. I'm Paul Smith, I'm Mary so-and-so. I stood up and I said, George Clayton Johnson. And they, wow, what a weird thing. He's using his old... And anyway, push that aside. We're now here for a serious business. The year is 1959. Richard Nixon is our vice president. Dwight D. Eisenhower is our president. He's telling the country, you ought to buy now, because the steel business is in bad trouble, as is everything else. There's a war in Vietnam. The black people are becoming very restive over the situation they find themselves in. All the children are going to San Francisco to get away from their parents. James Dean is a rebel without a cause. Alienation is one of the words the psychiatric fraternity puts on it. But the fact is that everybody was disgusted with the way the world was going on and the lives they were living. And they were also completely proscribed in their activities and in their thought. Everybody had a pair of black shoes and a pair of brown shoes. They wore the black shoes on Sunday and they wore the brown shoes every other day. Most people didn't have suits, but those who had suits were running things. The schools were worse then than they are now. The country was in a mess, and the year was 1959. In those few years leading up to 1959, I was a guy who had quit his job as an architectural draftsman at the time, working in various blue bird factories, Lockheed, Douglas, United States Steel, Hydro Air Incorporated. A number of highly prestigious firms hired me to be a draftsman, and I was a 9-to-5 guy who absolutely hated 9 to 5. I read a dedication Ray Bradbury wrote in one of his books: if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. And I was dedicated to that thought. I was contrary. I really did not want a 9-to-5 job. I had no certification other than that, because I was a 6th grade failure and a 9th grade dropout, 8th grade dropout. I ran away from home when I was 15 with my mother's permission, because I browbeat her for half the night in order to convince her that I really didn't want to stay there and that I was going to go somewhere else. And if they picked me up in Nevada or Arizona or someplace, the cops, and they called home to say, do you know that your son is in Arizona? She was supposed to say, oh yes, I gave him permission. And she must have done that a couple of times, because nobody hauled me in and locked me up. I was, however, by the time I was 17, I joined the Army, where I began to learn how to be a cartographer, because although they trained me as a telegraph operator, they sent me to a war zone where there were no telegraphs and no military railways. And they gave me an opportunity to choose something to do, and I saw a drafting section in one of the shops, and I said, there's where I want to be.